join with ADP. It will join with ADP. So, makakahimuhiyahin upat ng ATP. Only that 2 ATPs will be used during the process. Now, aside from ATP, another compound that will be produced is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide hydrogen, NADH. Okay, NADH. Okay. Now, nicotinamide adenine dihydrogen phosphate will only be produced when this glyceraldehyde phosphate continues the process to produce pyruvate. So this glycerol, these two molecules of 3-carbon compound, these 3 molecules of GAP will undergo chemical reaction to produce pyruvate. Okay, di ba? Duha nga GAP ang maproproduce from glycolysis. Ano? Each GAP will undergo reaction to become pyruvic acid. This one will undergo reaction to become pyruvic acid. Okay? Nakuha? Nakuha niyo? Now,
Yes, ma'am.
for every molecule
Yes,
of glucose, how many pyruvates will be made? How many pyruvates will be made? For every glucose molecule, how many pyruvates will be made? How many?
One ba?
Two. The answer is? The answer is 2. 1.
3.
1. Another pyruvate. So that makes 2. Okay. Inihiya kasi tikang dinhi. Adiya tikang didi. Ini naman hiya nga dudo nga gap tikang hen. How many glucose molecule? How many? Tikang hen. How many glucose?
1.
Very good. Tikang lahin usa nga glucose. Diba glucose is a 6-carbon sugar? 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is glucose. So glucose will split to become 2 molecules of GAP. That its GAP will undergo series of reactions, or it will undergo reaction, chemical reaction to become pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Ini may himo nga di, adihi makakahimo hadi. Or mahihimo nga pyruvate, adihi mahihimo nga pyruvate. In other words, for every glucose molecule, only 2 pyruvates will be made. Uha. During the process, 2 NADH are made. During the process. So when the 2 GAP molecules undergo reactions to become pyruvates or pyruvic acids or pyruvic acid molecules, 2 NADH are made. Kuha. Okay. Now, there are cases wherein oxygen is not available. There are cases wherein oxygen is not available. So, if oxygen is not available in the mitochondrion, if oxygen is not available in the cell, or if oxygen is not available in the mitochondrion, glycolysis will proceed to fermentation. Okay? Okay, balik kita. So, ada ang summary ngayon. So this is glycolysis. So this is not a summary. Total net yield. So in glycolysis, it is able to produce 2 molecules of pyruvates, 2 molecules of ATPs, and 2 molecules of NADH. Please take this down. And please remember this. I might include this in the quiz. Again, in glycolysis, it is able to produce 2 molecules of pyruvate, 2 molecules of ATP, 2 molecules of NADH. Tikang pa daw diin and pyruvate. Tikang diin. Tikang han, what compound?
Glucose.
Tikang han,
GAP.
tikang han,
GAP.
Very good. Tikang han, GAP.
Glyceraldehyde.
And GAP naman, tikang han, glucose.
Glucose.
An ATP, tikang diin. ATP, tikang inhiya diin. Tikang hinano nga molecule.
Glucose.
ATP. ADP, very good. Adenosine
ADP.
diphosphate. ADP. Tikang hiyan ADP ha. NADH, tikang hiya diin. Tikang hiya diin. NADH.
ATP. Oh, dali.
From tikang hiya diin. Tikang hin NAD. Nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Okay, so hydrogen will accept electrons. It will become energized. Okay, please, may ada naka-on it microphone. Please turn it off. Maulo na talinga. Please turn it off. Okay, thank you. Okay, so inside the cell, hydrogen will accept electrons, and as it accept electrons, so it will become energized. So ka-energized hining hydrogen, it will join with NAD to become NADH. Okay. Now, as what I've said, kanina, there are instances wherein oxygen is not available inside the cell. Oxygen is not available inside the cell. So, glycolysis will proceed to fermentation. Wait lang anay ha. I-go off ko lang. Madali.
Okay.
Okay, class, I'm back. Okay, so fermentation happens only when no oxygen is present inside the cell. Glycolysis is part of fermentation. Let me ask you now, Is glycolysis aerobic or anaerobic respiration?
Anaerobic.
Aerobic or anaerobic?
Anaerobic.
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 Aerobic. Very good. It is anaerobic.
Anaerobic.
Meaning to say, it doesn't require energy to produce, it doesn't require oxygen to produce ATP. Okay? Asya nga, since it doesn't need oxygen to produce ATP, only a minimal amount of ATP is produced. Guti lahiya. Because there is no oxygen needed or there is no oxygen present. Now, as what I've said, when the cell doesn't have oxygen, then glycolysis will proceed to fermentation. Like glycolysis, fermentation takes place in the cytosol. It happens in the cytosol of the cytoplasm. Okay? Now, there are two types of fermentation. One is alcohol or alcoholic fermentation. The other one is lactic acid fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation takes place in plants. So, in plants, that have plants, if there is no oxygen present, then glycolysis will proceed to alcoholic fermentation or alcohol fermentation. In animals, when there is no oxygen present in the cell, glycolysis will proceed to lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation. Okay. So let's take alcoholic fermentation, which is possible in plants and fungi. So plants and fungi undergo alcoholic fermentation to produce alcoholic drinks. Okay? So beer and wine are a few of the products of alcoholic fermentation in plants. Okay, now look at the diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 6 carbon sugar, the 6 carbon glucose will undergo glycolysis to produce pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Di ba, mahimuan na yung gap, from gap to pyruvate, di ba? Okay, now, when oxygen is not available inside the cell, so glycolysis will proceed to alcoholic fermentation in plants or in plants and fungi. Okay, now, this pyruvic acid, these two molecules of pyruvic acid will undergo chemical reactions. It will undergo series of reactions. So, dinhe, der magamitin ATP ha, it iya gagamiton nga energy will come from NADH. Okay. Oxygen is released, carbon dioxide rather is released when pyruvic acid undergoes reaction to produce ethanol. Ethanol is an alcohol. Okay. Ethanol is a 2-carbon compound. Masing ka naman, mahinga matanusa kay di ba di 1, 2, 3. Tapos, it underwent reaction to become alcohol. Duha lahi ang carbon. Nahingay naman ano sa carbon class. Nahingay na ano sa carbon. Diba? 1, 2, 3. Nahimuhiya nga ethanol. Ethanol is a 2-carbon compound. So nahingain naman ano sa kay tutulungan hira, nahingain naman ano sa. Anybody? Anybody? Nahingain ano sa class? It was used to produce carbon dioxide. It was used to produce carbon dioxide. Eh di ba, pipira pa daw nga pyruvic acid, it mag-undergo in reaction 1 or 2? 2. 2. So in one glucose molecule, two molecules of alcohol will be made, and it will also make 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. Okay? Asya nga, in fermentation, makaka-notice ka mo, in fermentation, so di ba itong tuba, nagbibinora itong hiya, naghihimong tuba, di ba? Nagbubura itong hiya. That bubble is actually carbon dioxide. Okay? Itong beer, kaya nagbubura itong hiya. Those bubbles are actually carbon dioxide. Okay? So itong fermentation, actually, na-produce itong yan carbon dioxide aside from the alcohol. Okay. Kuha. Alcoholic fermentation happens when glycolysis, when plant cells and fungi cells doesn't have available oxygen. Okay, so glycolysis will proceed the fermentation. Now, the making of wine, the making of alcoholic drinks requires sugar. Okay, it requires glucose. Okay? Kasi ito nga mga kuan, nga mga iton kuan kasi di ba makaka-notice ka po itong tuba nga bata pang tuba matamis iton hiya because there is sugar in it. There is sugar in it. Okay? Now in the absence of oxygen, that sugar will undergo fermentation to produce alcohol. Okay? The longer the fermentation, the more alcohol will be produced. Asya nga itong mga aged nga wine, mas mahal itong mga tagpira na kay years nga wine nga nag-undergo in fermentation, mas mahal kesa itong tagpira la kabulan nga paghimuhin wine. Okay, the reason for that is because there is more alcohol in aged wine than or as compared to younger wines. Kuha? Halaan, paghimot bahalina, for example, so paghimot bahalina, kung kay ano nga, mas mahal itong bahalina kesa itong ordinaryo lang nga tuba, kay maiha itong iya fermentation. Maiha itong iya process. Maiha itong process paghimo itong alcohol. So, ginpipinadamo pa itong alcohol, ginpipinadamo. Asya nga, mas mahal itong bahalina. Kay guti lang nga pag-inom, nahuhubog na itong tao because of the alcohol content in it. Okay? Questions? We go to the next. So, lactic acid fermentation, as what I've said just a while ago, lactic acid fermentation occurs in animal cells. Animal cells. Masin ka naman, nag-undergo ngayon kitahin fermentation? Yes. During emergency cases. You'll notice. When you work out, you will feel pain in your muscles. Because your muscle cells run out of oxygen. Now, for these cells to go on living, for these cells to survive, it must produce adenosine triphosphate. Paano yung makakaproduce in adenosine triphosphate? Through fermentation. Okay, so through fermentation, through glycolysis rather. Now, since there is no oxygen available kay ginagamit hiton ibang cells or makusog ka gumamit hiton ATP. So makusog bali an ATP, you run out of ATP and you also run out of oxygen as you work out, as you exercise. So ito na hinanabo, since these cells must go on living, it must survive, otherwise kung waray good hangin mamatay iton hiya. Anyway, so magkakami-ara emergency hiton cell to produce ATP through glycolysis. And since oxygen is still not available, it will proceed to lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so it started with the glucose molecule will undergo glycolysis to produce pyruvic acid. Oxygen is not available in the cell. So it will proceed to lactic acid fermentation to produce 2 molecules of lactic acid. Okay. Now here in the lactic acid fermentation, the NADH produced during glycolysis will undergo reduction to produce 2 molecules of NAD. Okay, now, when this lactic acid is accumulated, when these lactic acid molecules are accumulated inside our muscle cells, what happens is we feel pain. Nagkakamay-ada, a condition we call as cramping. Ito nga nagkakamay-ada. Naka-experience na kamo hini nga nag-cramps itong iyo tiil, kung nagsiswim ka mo, nag-cramps itong tiil. Siya ba? Kasi itong ginagamit when we swim, itong atong ginagamit is our legs. Okay, so dito itong atong legs na kinahanglan niya hindabong energy. Okay? Tapos naman, we run out of oxygen, so nag-undergo ang cell hin lactic acid fermentation. So the end product of lactic acid fermentation is of course lactic acid. So ini nga lactic acid matirok na nga ni diditon aton legs, matirok na nga ni diditon aton mga muscles in our legs. We will feel pain. And that is what we call as cramping. Parang natikig iton aton kuan, natikig iton aton mga muscles in our legs because of the accumulated lactic acid. Okay? Questions? This only becomes possible when oxygen is not available inside cells. Questions? Okay, so these are the end products in alcoholic fermentation. 2 molecules of ATP, tikang inhiniyadiin from glycolysis. 2 molecules of carbon dioxide and 2 molecules of ethanol. In lactic acid fermentation, it is also able to produce 2 molecules of ATP. Remember that glycolysis is the first part of fermentation as siya nga may ada ATP. Okay? So, lactic acid fermentation will also produce 2 molecules of NADH and 2 molecules of lactic acid. Okay, questions? Please feel free to ask. Feel free to ask. Okay na? Okay, so in today's discussion, so in the production of ATP, it occurs in the production of ATP or so this cellular respiration. It occurs in the mitochondrion, and in cellular respiration, it involves three stages: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and ETC or electron transport chain. Of the three, glycolysis is anaerobic, while Krebs cycle and ETC are aerobic. Okay. If oxygen is not yet available in the cell, glycolysis will proceed to fermentation. And there are two types of fermentation: alcoholic fermentation, which happens in plants, and lactic acid fermentation, which happens in, or which occurs in animal cells.
Animals.
Okay. Okay. I hope you learned something today. Did you learn something?
Yes.
Yes po, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so
Very much.
that ends the discussion. We'll proceed with the Krebs cycle and ETC tomorrow. Okay.
Thank you po, ma'am.
Okay, so may I request everyone to turn on the camera? Please turn on the camera for the last checking of attendance. Okay, so this is first page. We go to the second page. Okay, so later I will send for through email. Hinon wari makareceive ka kulopin score.
Mami ako, ma'am.
Ha email wari ka mapaka-receive.
Waray, ma'am.
Name.
Ninya po, ma'am.
Hindi niya. Wari ka maka-receive.
Waray po, ma'am.
Ay ano, ginbutang mo imo bang asyan imo gingamit nga email ad. Di man
Po,
di meron
ma'am.
ka man. Oh, hala. Anay ha, kita ko ni mo score. May ada mo man didi. Anay, okay lah yung basang ko score. Dire.
Sige po, ma'am.
Opo.
Okay la?
Okay.
Okay la.
Opo, opo.
Opo, ma'am.
Okay.
Kasi
Pero
didito
basta-
na akong Google. Kasi didito na akong Google Classroom kasi na-appear ang iyo score. Anyo sa 8 from section Santol ha, you listen to this. Santol. Anyo sa 8, Bulanadi 9, Katalo 10, Samson Radel 8, Adamas 9, Alaya 7, Amos 8, Apura Dennis 7, Cesista 9, Dulfo 10, Galupe 8, Gapud 7, Garcia 8, Gura 9, Hilaria 6, Habule 8, Latoha 10, Mendoza 10, Montes 9, Pagayanan 6, Pan 9, Ramirez 8, Rejang 9, Sabido 8, and Padilla 9. Okay, we go to section Mango. Section Mango. Ano section Mango? Damo gyapon wala maka-receive. Ha?
Ako po, waray.
Name. Your name. Family name.
Marasigan Makshan Heart.
Marasigan. Okay. So Apita, Zion 8, Araba 9, Banaldia 9, Bantiles 10, Hardillo 9, Malinaw 8, Marasigan Christian 8, Nicart 8, Ugale 8, Solayaw 9, Uy 7, Aberia 7, Abobo 8, Afable 9, Alde 10, Ambil 9, Amoyo 9, Ampong 6, Apura 9, Polima 9, Dator 10, De Los Santos 9, Jolola 7, Docena 9, Gapate 9, Guevara 10, Lavado 8, Marasigan 6, Menzon 9, Peralta 8, Promeda 9, and Sakmar 9. Okay. Okay na. So, paki-check hit iyo email ha, paki-check because I will release now your score. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope you learned something from the discussion today. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye po, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye. Thank you po, ma'am.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, ma'am.
Ma'am.